My windshield wipers slammed back and forth so hard they almost sounded angry, fighting to clear the sheets of freezing Virginia rain while I steered my old sedan through the winding road toward the Montgomery estate. Mud covered both sides of the car from the last naval legal training exercise I'd driven home from, and I didn't bother stopping for a wash. There wasn't much point. The people waiting for me had already decided what they were going to see. A folded paper invitation rested on the passenger seat, heavy cream-colored cardstock, gold lettering. Please join the family for an intimate birthday dinner honoring Jocelyn. My mother had signed it herself in blue ink. That was strange enough to make me keep it instead of tossing it in the recycling bin. She almost never wrote anything by hand. I checked the dashboard clock as I turned through the front gates, 6:42 p.m. The security guard recognized my last name before he recognized me. Welcome home, Commander. I nodded. Thank you. The mansion looked exactly the same as it had the day I left for officer candidate school years ago. Fresh stonework, perfect hedges, every window glowing with warm light. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked untouched by real life. I parked beside a row of imported SUVs and stepped out into the cold rain. My civilian coat had wrinkles from being stuffed behind my driver's seat for 2 weeks. My navy garment bag stayed in the trunk. Tonight wasn't supposed to require a uniform. I grabbed the invitation, locked the car, and walked toward the front entrance. The butler opened the door before I could knock. Good evening, Miss Montgomery. It's Lieutenant Commander now. He smiled politely. Of course. Inside, polished hardwood floors reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead. The house smelled overwhelmingly of imported white lilies. Someone had ordered hundreds of them. Crystal glasses clinked somewhere deeper inside the mansion, followed by soft laughter and live string music. Birthday dinner? This looked more like a fundraiser. Or a wedding. I hadn't taken 3 more steps before my mother appeared. Victoria Montgomery wore an ivory designer gown that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Diamonds sparkled around her neck. She looked at my face for less than a second before her eyes settled on my coat. Jocelyn. Happy to see you too, Mom. She ignored that. Did you really drive that car here? I blinked. My car? The muddy one parked in front. I've been working. I can see that. She lowered her voice. Move it around the side immediately. Genevieve's guests will be arriving any minute, and I don't want that thing being the first vehicle they notice. Not hello. Not happy birthday. Just move your car. I was invited. You were. That doesn't mean your vehicle has to greet everyone. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I handed her the invitation. You mailed this. She glanced at it like she'd forgotten it existed. Yes, well, plans evolved. That answer sat in my head longer than it should have. Plans evolved. Before I could ask what that meant, 2 catering staff hurried past carrying silver trays covered with champagne flutes. One whispered to the other. The engagement photographer just arrived. Engagement? I looked back toward my mother. She had already turned away. Please hurry with your car. Outside again, I climbed back into my sedan and slowly drove it behind the detached garage where it disappeared from view, hidden. Apparently, even my transportation embarrassed the Montgomery family. I shut off the engine but didn't move for a few seconds. Inside the glove compartment sat another envelope. Not from my parents, from my grandfather. General Alistair Montgomery had mailed it years before his death with one handwritten instruction across the front. Open only if your family ever asks you to choose between your integrity and your last name. I'd never opened it, not once. I ran my thumb across the sealed edge before placing it back inside the compartment. Not tonight, at least. I didn't think so. By the time I returned to the front entrance, luxury cars lined both sides of the circular driveway. Men in tailored tuxedos. Women wearing dresses that belonged on magazine covers. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. Except me. One older couple smiled politely. I assume you're with the Navy? Yes. Oh. Genevieve is inside. She's absolutely radiant tonight. There it was again. Genevieve. Not birthday. Not family dinner. Genevieve. I followed the crowd toward the ballroom. A florist adjusted another arrangement of white lilies. Someone rolled in a 5-tier cake covered in fresh orchids. The gold lettering across the front hadn't been covered yet. I froze. Congratulations, Genevieve and Nathan. The decorator noticed me, staring, and quickly turned the cake away. Oops. Oops. My birthday dinner apparently required a wedding cake. A young violinist tested a few notes while servers carried trays of lobster bites and roasted tenderloin through the hallway. Nobody offered me anything. Nobody even looked surprised that I was standing there. Then I noticed framed engagement photographs displayed along the grand staircase. Dozens of them, printed, mounted, professionally lit. This had been planned for weeks, maybe months. The invitation in my pocket suddenly felt much heavier. I kept walking until I reached the main entrance to the ballroom. The massive double doors stood wide open. Gold banners hung from the ceiling. Hundreds of candles flickered across polished tables. A giant floral display framed a raised stage, where my younger sister laughed beside a man wearing an expensive custom tuxedo, while photographers shouted instructions. My father lifted a champagne glass. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us to celebrate the future of the Montgomery family. Applause erupted. I stayed exactly where I was. Nobody called my name. Nobody wished me a happy birthday. Nobody seemed to notice I was even standing there. In that quiet little space between the front doors and the celebration, I finally understood why my mother had wanted my car hidden. I hadn't been invited home to celebrate turning 32. I'd been invited to disappear quietly into the background, while my birthday became a surprise engagement gala for my younger sister. And as I stood there holding the invitation that still claimed this night belonged to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the unopened letter waiting inside my glove compartment was about to become the most important thing my grandfather had ever left me. This open-loop mystery follows the retention guidance of placing a compelling unresolved secret in part 1. I slipped my invitation back into my coat pocket and walked into the ballroom without saying a word. A hostess holding a seating chart smiled at me. Your name? Jocelyn Montgomery. She ran her finger down the list before stopping near the bottom. Oh, that single word told me everything. She picked up one place card and pointed toward the far end of the dining room. You're right over there. Not beside my parents, not near the bride-to-be, not even with the rest of the Montgomery relatives. My chair waited at the very end of a long mahogany table beside the veranda doors. Every few seconds, a cold draft slipped through the old wooden frame, making the nearby candles flicker. I pulled out the chair and sat down. Across the room, Genevieve occupied the center seat beneath the crystal chandelier. Her new diamond ring caught every beam of light. She stretched out her left hand every chance she got, letting cousins, friends, and influencers crowd around her. Oh my gosh, it's almost 5 carats, Nathan laughed. 4.8. Someone whistled. It must have cost a fortune. Genevieve smiled without an ounce of embarrassment. A girl only gets engaged once. I quietly poured myself a glass of water. Nobody at my end of the table seemed interested in conversation. Most of the guests probably assumed I was another military acquaintance invited out of courtesy. In fairness, my family had spent years making me feel exactly like that. One of my older cousins finally noticed me. Jack. I looked up. Hey, Ethan. I didn't know you'd be here. I had the same thought. He gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. You still with the Navy? Still there. You ever think about getting out? Corporate law pays a lot better. I sleep better where I am. He nodded. I guess that's worth something. Before either of us could continue, my father stood and tapped a spoon against his crystal glass. The room gradually fell silent. Charles Montgomery never needed to raise his voice. He expected silence, and he usually got it. Ladies and gentlemen, he smiled toward Genevieve. Tonight isn't simply about celebrating an engagement. Applause started before he'd even finished the sentence. It is about honoring the future of our family. Another wave of applause. Charles lifted his wine glass. Genevieve has always understood something that many people never do. He paused dramatically. Legacy. More smiles, more nods, more expensive watches lifted champagne flutes into the air. My younger daughter understands that a family's name carries responsibility. It carries influence. It opens doors. She has embraced that responsibility with grace. I looked down at the tablecloth, not because his words hurt, because they sounded rehearsed. He continued, Tonight, I proudly recognize Genevieve as the true pride of the Montgomery bloodline, the only daughter who truly understands what legacy means. The room erupted into applause. Someone shouted, Here! Here! Crystal glasses clinked all around the room. Across the table, Genevieve dabbed at the corner of one eye without ruining her makeup. Thank you, Dad. Then she looked straight at me. Only for a second. Long enough to make sure I had heard every word. Long enough to know exactly who wasn't included. I took another sip of water. Years inside the Navy had taught me something useful. Not every attack deserved an immediate response. Sometimes silence made people reveal much more than an argument ever could. Dinner service began. 4 waiters carried polished silver trays through the ballroom with the precision of a military drill team. The smell reached my end of the table first. Roasted ribeye, garlic butter, fresh rosemary, grilled asparagus. Someone behind me whispered, "That smells incredible." A young waiter stopped beside my chair. "Ma'am." He gently lowered a large porcelain plate toward me. Before it reached the table, another hand appeared. "My apologies, Victoria." She smiled politely at the waiter. "That entree belongs at the family table." The waiter looked confused. "But this seat number, I know exactly where it belongs." Without another word, my mother lifted the plate herself and carried it toward Genevieve. "Oh, sweetheart," she said warmly, "you must be starving." Genevieve laughed. I wasn't going to complain. Victoria placed the steak in front of her daughter. "There you are." Nathan looked around. "I thought everyone was getting the same dinner." We made a few adjustments. My mother smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. The waiter still stood beside me, clearly unsure what to do. Victoria returned a moment later, carrying a small bread plate, 2 cold dinner rolls, nothing else. She set it down in front of me. There. The butter dish was missing. Even the rolls felt dry enough to crumble. The waiter quietly asked, "Should I bring another entree from the kitchen?" "No." Victoria's answer came instantly. She leaned closer until only I could hear her. "People who don't contribute to this family's social standing shouldn't expect to feast on its resources." Her perfume almost covered the smell of the bread. Almost. I looked at the rolls, then at my mother. "You mailed me a birthday invitation. I mailed what was appropriate at the time, so this wasn't a mistake." "No." She straightened one of the linen napkins. "You've chosen a very respectable military career." Respectable. Not admirable, not meaningful, just respectable. "But respect doesn't build influence," she continued softly. "Your sister does." I couldn't help smiling. "A small one. The kind that confused people." Victoria frowned. "Is something amusing?" I was just thinking. "About what?" "How differently people define the word contribute." She stared at me for a second before turning away without answering. I broke one of the rolls in half. It really was stale. Even Ethan looked uncomfortable. "You want half my steak?" I shook my head. "I'm good. You've barely eaten. I've gone through survival training with less." That earned a quiet laugh from him. "Fair point." Across the room, Genevieve lifted her wine glass toward a group of friends. "After Italy, we're thinking about a month in the Maldives." One friend gasped. "Your honeymoon alone is probably worth my annual salary." Genevieve shrugged. "Dad says memories are the best investment." Charles smiled proudly. "They certainly are." I watched them from the far end of the table while another cold gust slipped through the veranda doors. Nobody noticed. Nobody except the elderly groundskeeper walking past outside. He happened to glance through the glass. For just a second, our eyes met. He gave me the smallest nod before continuing on with his work. He remembered. He had worked for my grandfather for nearly 30 years. He knew who usually sat at the head of the table whenever General Alistair Montgomery hosted family dinners. It had never been the loudest person. It had never been the richest person. It had always been the person he trusted most. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the edge of my grandfather's unopened envelope. For the first time that evening, I wondered if he'd seen this family becoming exactly what it was, long before anyone else did. I brushed the crumbs from my hands, slipped the untouched dinner roll onto my bread plate, and stood before anyone could ask why I was leaving. I had barely reached the hallway when I heard my father's voice behind me. "Jocelyn." I turned. "Come to my study." He didn't wait for an answer. He simply walked away, expecting me to follow. Some habits never changed. The farther I moved from the ballroom, the quieter the house became. The string quartet faded behind thick walls until all I could hear was the muffled laughter from the party and the steady ticking of my grandfather's antique grandfather clock in the hallway. My father's study looked exactly as I remembered. Dark walnut bookshelves. Leather-bound law books that had probably never been opened. A polished mahogany desk positioned like a judge's bench. Behind it hung an oversized portrait of General Alistair Montgomery in full dress uniform. The irony wasn't lost on me. The one man in this family who had actually earned respect was silently watching everything from the wall. Charles stood beside the desk with both hands behind his back. Genevieve leaned against the fireplace, casually adjusting the sleeve of her silk designer gown while admiring her engagement ring. The fourth person in the room stood as I entered. Gray suit, silver briefcase, perfect posture. I recognized him immediately. Mr. Preston Hale. He offered a professional smile. Lieutenant Commander. He had been my grandfather's corporate attorney during the final years of his life. After the funeral, he'd quietly remained my father's legal advisor. Charles closed the study door himself. I won't waste your time. I'd appreciate that. He gestured toward the chair across the desk. Sit. I remained standing. I'm fine. His jaw tightened for a second before he reached into a leather folder and slid several documents across the polished surface. They're straightforward. I looked down. The heading caught my attention immediately. Revocable Success or Trustee Amendment. Beneath it sat the familiar name, Montgomery Military Legacy Trust. Every trace of humor disappeared from my face. I slowly picked up the document. My grandfather had established the trust decades earlier to preserve military investments, defense bonds, scholarship funding for service members' families, and several historic properties connected to Montgomery veterans. The trust wasn't a personal checking account. It operated under strict fiduciary obligations. I continued reading. Halfway down the second page, I found exactly what I expected. Current successor trustee, Lieutenant Commander Jocelyn Montgomery, proposed successor trustee. Charles Montgomery looked up. So that's why I was invited. Charles folded his arms. I invited you because paperwork is easier done in person. No, I placed the pages back onto the desk. You invited me because Grandpa made sure you couldn't touch this trust without my signature. Nobody answered. Silence answered well enough. Genevieve finally spoke. You make that sound so dramatic. It is dramatic. She rolled her eyes. It's paperwork. No. I looked directly at her. It's legal authority over a trust worth several $1 million. She shrugged. Which should be helping the family. It already does. Charles leaned forward. Not efficiently. There it is. He tapped the document. You've made this unnecessarily complicated. The trust was designed to be complicated. It was designed before modern realities. I almost laughed. Federal fiduciary law hasn't changed nearly as much as you'd like. Mr. Hale cleared his throat. The amendment is legally permissible if voluntarily executed. Voluntarily. I repeated the word carefully. Important choice. Charles ignored that. We have immediate obligations. Genevieve finally stepped away from. We already found the estate. What estate? Lake Como. She smiled proudly. Private. Shoreline. I waited. 22 guest suites. She kept going. Historic villa. Boathouse. Gardens. It's perfect. Nathan and I want the wedding there. Charles nodded. The seller requires proof of available funds before the end of the month. How much? Genevieve answered before anyone else could. 1.5 million. She said it the same way someone might mention buying new shoes. It'll come from the trust capital. I stared at her. You want to withdraw $1.5 million from a military legacy trust. For the wedding. To buy an Italian estate. For the venue, I looked toward Charles. You actually think that's legal? It benefits the Montgomery family. It benefits Genevieve. They're the same thing. No, they're not. Charles walked around the desk until we stood only a few feet apart. Your grandfather created that trust to protect this family. He created it to protect military assets from this family. His expression hardened. You've become cynical. I've become a Navy lawyer. Exactly. He said it like an accusation. You think like a bureaucrat instead of a Montgomery. I think like a fiduciary. Mr. Hale quietly adjusted his glasses. The amendment would simplify future administration. I looked at him. Counselor, have you actually read his Section 4? His eyes flickered. I've reviewed the document. Then you know the trustee has an affirmative duty to reject distributions that primarily benefit private individuals. Nobody spoke. So either you overlooked that, I paused, or someone hoped I would. Genevieve sighed dramatically. Oh, for heaven's sake, she crossed her arms. You're acting like we're robbing Fort Knox. No, I answered calmly. I'm acting like someone is asking me to violate fiduciary law. Charles walked back behind the desk. His patience had officially disappeared. I've tried being reasonable. So have I. He opened another folder. This one was much thinner. I was hoping this wouldn't become necessary. Something about the way he smiled made the room feel colder. He slid a single sheet of paper toward me. It wasn't a legal document. It was a newspaper proof. The headline was already formatted. Novel legal officers, mental bias questioned. After Oversea's depayment, I didn't touch it. Charles watched my face carefully. The local paper owes me a few favors. Genevieve smiled without looking up from her ring. I told you she'd read it. I kept my voice level. The story's false. That won't matter. Charles leaned both hands on the desk. It mentions combat stress. I wasn't in combat. It mentions psychological instability. I've never been diagnosed with anything. It quotes anonymous sources. There aren't any. There will be. The room fell completely silent. Even Mr. Hale looked uncomfortable. Charles spoke one sentence at a time. The article gets published. He pointed toward the paper. The Navy opens an inquiry. Another tap. Questions get asked. Another. Your promotion stops. Another. Your reputation disappears. He looked me directly in the eyes. Sign the amendment tonight, and this draft never leaves the room. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly enough to hear. Behind my father, General Alistair Montgomery's portrait seemed almost impossible to ignore. The man who taught me that honor wasn't something you wore on your uniform. It was something you protected when nobody else wanted you to. I lowered my eyes to the amendment, then to the newspaper, then back to my father's face, and I realized this meeting had never been about family. It had been a carefully planned attempt to force a Navy officer into surrendering a legal duty under the threat of manufactured lies. I let the silence sit in the room while I read the amendment one more time. Years in the Navy had taught me that the loudest person usually wasn't the one in control. The person who stayed calm almost always saw something everyone else missed. I rested both hands on the edge of the desk. Inhale. 4 seconds. Hold. 4 seconds. Exhale. 4 seconds. Hold again. 4 seconds. My pulse slowed exactly the way it had during countless legal briefings and operational reviews. I didn't need a smartwatch to tell me I was sitting at roughly 62 beats per minute. Box breathing had become automatic long before tonight. Across from me, my father mistook my silence for hesitation. "Take your time," Charles said. "You'll reach the only reasonable decision." "No," I replied without looking up. "I'll reach the legal one." Genevieve gave an exaggerated sigh. There she goes again. I ignored her and continued reading. The amendment looked professionally drafted. The signatures, the witness block, the notarization instructions. Everything appeared clean. Too clean. The language transferred nearly every meaningful authority from me to Charles while leaving every legal liability attached to the trustee position during the transition period. Convenient. Very convenient. If anything illegal happened after tonight, the paperwork would create weeks of confusion over responsibility. That wasn't sloppy law, that was intentional law. I placed the document neatly back onto the desk. "You paid someone a great deal of money to write this, Mr. Hale straightened slightly. "I prepared it, I know." I looked directly at him, and whoever drafted it understands fiduciary exposure very well. Charles smiled. "So we're finished reviewing?" "Yes." He slid a heavy silver fountain pen across the desk. The pen stopped directly in front of me. "Then sign." I picked it up. It felt heavier than it needed to. My grandfather used to keep that same pen in this office. He signed scholarship approvals with it. Letters to Gold Star families, donations to wounded veterans. Never once had I seen him use it to take something from another person. I turned the pen slowly between my fingers. Then something crossed my mind. Genevieve stood only a few feet away, admiring her engagement ring. Her car keys rested on the corner of the desk beside her designer purse. The silver keychain caught my attention. I recognized it immediately. 2 years earlier, she'd called me crying because she couldn't qualify for financing on her luxury SUV after another failed fashion business. She'd sworn she'd pay me back. Instead, I'd quietly covered the monthly payment myself. Every month. 24 straight payments, usually on the 15th, sometimes before deployment, sometimes sitting in airport terminals, sometimes from overseas. Never once had I mentioned it to anyone. Not even tonight. I looked at those keys. Then at my sister. She caught me staring. "What?" "Nothing." "What are you looking at?" I was remembering. She laughed. "You've always been weird. Maybe. Or maybe I'd simply spent too many years confusing responsibility with love." Charles tapped the desk. "The signature, Jocelyn." I looked down one last time. Then I carefully placed the silver fountain pen back onto the leather writing pad. Unsigned. Perfectly straight. Exactly where it belonged. The room became completely still. Charles didn't move. Genevieve stopped smiling. Even Mr. Hale slowly removed his glasses. "I won't sign." Charles blinked once. "I'm sorry?" I said no. Seemed to understand consequences. "I understand them perfectly. The newspaper. I heard you. The investigation." "Heard that too." You folded my hands calmly. If my career can be destroyed by a false article, then it wasn't worth much to begin with. Charles's face darkened. Don't test me. I'm not. I stood. I'm refusing to violate my fiduciary duty. Before anyone could answer, the study door opened. My mother walked in without knocking. Victoria looked from Charles to the unsigned paperwork and immediately understood what had happened. Her expression didn't show disappointment, only irritation. I knew this would happen. She closed the door behind her. She always has to make everything difficult. Charles remained silent. Victoria approached until she stood directly across from me. She studied my face the way someone inspects damaged furniture. You know what your problem is? I've heard several theories. You've spent so many years pretending to be honorable that you've forgotten where you came from. I know exactly where I came from. No, she shook her head. You've convinced yourself you're somehow better than your own family. I never said that. You don't have to. Her voice became colder with every sentence. You hide behind regulations. You hide behind uniforms. You hide behind rules, I answered quietly. I follow the law. You worship paperwork. I respect responsibility. She laughed once, a sharp, humorless laugh. Responsibility? She gestured toward the portrait of General Alistair Montgomery. Everything you have came from this family. No, I met her eyes. Everything worthwhile came from Grandpa. For the first time that evening, she looked genuinely offended. You are nothing but a cold, rigid clerk who has leached off the Montgomery family name. The words hung in the room. I almost smiled. Almost. Because the truth was so backwards, it would have sounded funny if it weren't so sad. Neither of them knew. Not about the property taxes. Not about the overdue insurance premiums I'd quietly covered. Not about the roof repairs after the winter storm. Not about Genevieve's car payments. Not about the trust reports I'd spent weekends preparing without billing a single hour. For 3 years, I'd been using my own Navy paycheck to keep pieces of this family's financial life from collapsing, while making sure every trust expense remained legal. And somehow I was the one living off them. Charles suddenly grabbed the amendment from the desk hard enough to wrinkle the first page. So that's your final answer. Yes. He took one step closer, then another, until he was standing directly in front of me. His voice stayed surprisingly calm, almost conversational. We didn't forget your birthday. For one brief moment, I wondered if those words might lead somewhere different. They didn't. We just didn't see the point. The sentence landed harder than any shouted insult could have. He didn't stop there. You are officially cut off. He pointed toward the study door. Do not contact this family again. Then he smiled. The kind of smile someone wears after believing they've won. One small detail spoiled the moment. He called me the wrong name. Sabrina. Not Jocelyn. Not Jack. Sabrina. He couldn't even be bothered to use the name of the daughter he had just disowned. I looked at him for another second. Then at my mother, then at Genevieve, who never corrected him. Nobody did. I reached for neither the amendment nor the newspaper proof. Instead, I quietly buttoned my wrinkled coat, turned the brass doorknob, and walked out of the study carrying nothing except the folded birthday invitation that had never really been meant for me. I pulled the front door shut behind me and kept walking until the music from the ballroom disappeared behind the sound of freezing rain hitting the driveway. Nobody came after me. No one called my name. The valet standing under the covered entrance looked like he wanted to say something, but he thought better of it after seeing my face. I unlocked my sedan, climbed inside, and closed the door. For a few seconds, the only sound was my own breathing and the rain drumming against the roof. I didn't cry. I didn't pound the steering wheel. I didn't replay my father's words. I'd spent too many years around Marines and sailors to waste energy on emotions before making decisions. I reached behind the passenger seat and pulled out a rugged black laptop sealed inside a waterproof case. It wasn't my personal computer. It was the encrypted terminal I used for authorized trust administration and secure legal work. A biometric scanner lit up. Identity verification required. I placed my thumb on the sensor. A second later, facial recognition activated. Identity confirmed. The encrypted operating system loaded. 3 separate authentication windows appeared. Military credential, digital certificate, hardware security token. Less than a minute later, I was inside the Montgomery Military Legacy Trust Administration portal. The familiar dashboard appeared. Current trust value, 48,300,072 status, active successor trustee, lieutenant commander. Jocelyn Montgomery, everything looked normal. For now, I opened the activity ledger. Years of transactions filled the screen: scholarship disbursements, maintenance expenses, investment income, veterans assistance grants. Everything categorized. Everything documented. Then I selected another tab: Property Administration. The Pinecrest Road estate appeared. I already knew what I would find because I'd entered many of the records myself. Property taxes, paid. Insurance premium, paid. Emergency roof repair, paid. Water reimbursement column beside each payment remained blank, always blank. I clicked one transaction after another. County property tax, $18,942.07 funding source. Personal transfer, J. Montgomery another. Emergency HVAC replacement, $9.84 funding source. Personal transfer, J. Montgomery and Fonder. Storm damage tree removal, $3,487.50 funding source. Personal transfer, J. Montgomery. I leaned back in my seat. 3 years. 3 years of quietly filling financial holes nobody else even knew existed. Not because I wanted anyone's gratitude. Because if the estate fell into tax delinquency or deferred maintenance, the trust itself could suffer financial damage. Protecting the trust had always mattered more than proving a point. I opened my banking records. Every transfer matched. Every invoice had been uploaded. Every receipt had been scanned, clean, auditable. Exactly the way Grandpa had taught me. He used to say one sentence every trustee should memorize. The day your record stopped telling the truth is the day your signature stops meaning anything. I finally reached into the glove compartment. The sealed envelope waited exactly where I'd left it. This time I opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. Jack, if you're reading this, someone has probably asked you to choose family over duty. Don't. Blood gives people opportunities. Character determines whether they deserve them. The trust was never created to make Montgomerys wealthy. It exists to protect something much bigger than our last name. If the day ever comes when you honestly believe the trust itself is in danger, remember Section 4.7b. Do what I trained you to do. Love, Grandpa. I smiled for the first time all evening. Not because I felt victorious. Because even after his death, he somehow knew exactly what kind of crossroads I'd eventually face. I folded the letter and placed it beside the keyboard. Then I opened the compliance dashboard. Section 4.7b wasn't hidden. Grandpa had made sure of that. Emergency Fiduciary Protection Authority successor trustee may initiate an immediate administrative freeze upon reasonable suspicion of attempted non-compliant expenditure, fraud, coercion, breach of fiduciary duty, or unlawful interference with trust governance pending independent review. I read it twice. As a Navy JAG officer, I knew better than to act out of anger. Authority existed for a reason. So did procedure. I opened a new compliance report. The blinking cursor waited. Reason for review. I began typing. Attempted coercion of acting successor trustee through reputational threats in order to obtain unauthorized control of trust governance. Next line. Proposed withdrawal of approximately $1,100,000 in trust capital for private foreign real estate acquisition unrelated to trust purposes. Next. Potential attempt to circumvent fiduciary obligations through trustee substitution. Every statement had factual support. No opinions, no emotional language. Only facts. Exactly the kind of report I would expect another attorney to submit. I attached supporting documentation, the amendment, the trust governance records, meeting notes typed from memory while every conversation remained fresh. Then I opened the financial monitoring system. One screen listed every active payment method connected to the trust: corporate cards, estate maintenance accounts, vendor authorizations, country club billing, property management accounts, more than 40 active financial instruments. One command would suspend every discretionary transaction until investigators completed their review. The cursor hovered over the authorization box. I paused, not because I doubted the decision, because I understood its consequences. Genevieve's wedding plans, my parents' social calendar, their memberships, their spending. Everything supported by trust money would stop immediately, not forever. Only until independent auditors determined whether the trust had been misused. That wasn't revenge. That was exactly how fiduciary oversight was designed to work. Before confirming the action, something occurred to me that still makes me shake my head. What happened inside that study was already unbelievable. But before this case was over, it reminded me of another family we covered on this channel, where a hidden inheritance uncovered something even darker. If you're watching between minutes 45 and 55, keep an eye on the top right corner of your screen. That story fits this one in a way I never expected. This internal bridge follows the retention guidance specified for the midpoint of the story. I returned my attention to the screen. My password prompt appeared. Trustee authorization required. I entered my credentials. The final confirmation window opened. Activate fiduciary IRS. I clicked yes. Another field appeared. Compliance action. I selected active audit and fiduciary freeze reference. Section 4.7b electronic signature. Timestamp. Authentication complete. I pressed submit. Within 3 seconds, status notifications began appearing one after another. Discretionary distributions, suspended corporate payment cards, the lawed estate credit accounts, locked pending capital requests, frozen federal compliance division, not the trust dashboard changed color. Its green status banner disappeared. A bold red notice replaced it. Activated in progress, I closed the laptop, rested both hands on the steering wheel, and watched the lights of the Montgomery mansion glowing through the rain. Inside, they were probably finishing dessert. None of them had any idea that every dollar they believed they controlled had just stopped moving. The trust wasn't protecting my family anymore. It was protecting itself. I shut the laptop, locked it inside its waterproof case, and drove away from the mansion without looking back. 3 days passed. I went back to work. My mornings were filled with legal reviews, command briefings, and calls with Navy attorneys scattered across 3 time zones. Nobody at my office knew what had happened on my birthday, and I intended to keep it that way. My personal phone remained unusually quiet. No apology from my parents, no message from Genevieve, no attempt to negotiate. The only communication that arrived came through the trust's encrypted compliance portal. Active audit status. Accepted. Independent review teams assigned. Federal compliance notification confirmed. Exactly as the trust required. Nothing moved quickly in fiduciary law until it suddenly did. Late Saturday afternoon, I received another automated notification. Significant payment attempt detected. The location immediately caught my attention. Ashford Hills Country Club. I already knew what event was taking place there. Victoria had spent 6 months planning the annual country club charity auction. She'd talked about it at every holiday dinner, every family gathering, and every phone call she could trap me into answering. According to her, the entire city's political and business leadership would be attending. According to reality, it was another expensive evening where wealthy people competed to see whose donation received the longest applause. I didn't drive there. I didn't need to. The trust monitoring system provided real-time transaction alerts whenever frozen accounts were accessed. At Ashford Hills Country Club, the ballroom looked exactly the way my mother always imagined success should look. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. A live jazz quartet played softly near the stage. Silent auction tables displayed vacation packages, antique watches, and sports memorabilia. State senators mingled with developers. Hospital board members laughed beside corporate executives. Every table carried white lilies, Victoria's favorite flower. She stood near the stage wearing another custom designer gown, greeting guests as if she owned the building. My dear, we're so happy you could come. Senator, thank you for supporting this wonderful cause. Oh, you'll absolutely have to meet Genevieve. Genevieve didn't disappoint. She floated through the ballroom wearing a new silver evening dress that probably cost more than my first car. Her engagement ring remained impossible to ignore. Nathan followed beside her, shaking hands with anyone whose business card looked valuable. Charles worked the room differently. Politics, old favors, private conversations. He smiled the same smile I'd seen him use during election seasons years earlier. Confident, controlled, certain the room belonged to him. Near the front sat a large ceremonial check mounted on an easel. The Montgomery Legacy Trust charitable commitment, $500,000. I stared at the number through the compliance dashboard on my screen. No trustee approval, no supporting resolution, no authorized distribution. They weren't just spending money they didn't control. They were publicly promising it. 7 minutes later, another alert appeared. Pending transaction initiated. I opened the live authorization log. Payment source: Montgomery Legacy Trust Executive Account Merchant. Ashford Hills Country Club Foundation amount, $500,000 status. Awaiting authorization. The system didn't wait long. Authorization denied. Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, Victoria stepped onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. She accepted the microphone with practiced elegance. Friends, the room quieted. For generations, the Montgomery family has believed that privilege carries responsibility. I almost laughed. She continued, "Tonight marks not only another successful charity auction, but the beginning of an extraordinary new chapter." She smiled toward Genevieve and Nathan, the union of two remarkable families. Applause filled the ballroom again. Charles lifted his champagne glass proudly. Victoria continued speaking. "In honor of this wonderful occasion, the Montgomery Legacy Trust is proud to contribute $500,000 to support veterans' educational initiatives." That part almost sounded respectable. If only she'd had legal authority to say it. The audience stood. People clapped. Several guests even began recording with their phones. The event coordinator walked onto the stage carrying a wireless payment terminal. "Mrs. Montgomery." She smiled. "Whenever you're ready." Victoria accepted the device with complete confidence. She removed a sleek black card from her designer clutch. One smooth motion. Tap. The terminal processed. 1 second. 2, 3. Then the screen flashed bright red. "Account frozen, regular lock." The coordinator frowned. "I'm sorry." Victoria blinked. There must be a mistake. She tapped again. Same result. A louder warning tone sounded. Several guests in the front row exchanged confused looks. Charles quietly stepped toward the stage. "Try again." The coordinator hesitated. "I already have." Victoria forced a laugh into the microphone. "Technology," a few polite chuckles answered. She inserted the card instead. Processing. Another pause. Then another bright red screen. "Tatamanadikalinged account frozen." Regulatory lock this time. The warning tone echoed through the ballroom speakers. The applause disappeared. The jazz quartet stopped playing. Nobody said a word. The event coordinator lowered her voice. "Mrs. Montgomery, this account appears to be restricted." "That's impossible." "It's regulatory lock." Charles reached for the terminal. "Let me see." He stared at the display. The color drained from his face almost instantly. Victoria whispered through clenched teeth, "Use another account." "I am." He pulled out a second corporate card. Declined. A third. Declined. Same warning, same red screen. Guests were no longer pretending not to notice. Whispers spread from table to table. "What's happening? I thought they funded this event. Did the bank shut them down?" Genevieve hurried toward the stage. "Dad?" Charles ignored her. He was already dialing someone on his phone, straight to voicemail. Then another number. No answer. The ballroom doors opened quietly. Ashford Hill's general manager, Richard Holloway, walked in carrying a slim black folder. He wasn't smiling. He approached the stage without rushing and waited politely until Victoria noticed him. "Mrs. Montgomery." She looked relieved. "Richard, thank goodness. I'm afraid I need a private word." "It can wait." "I'm sorry." His voice stayed calm. "It really can't." He leaned close enough that only those nearest the stage could hear. Unfortunately for Victoria, the microphone hanging around her neck remained live. "Your Premier Heritage membership has been suspended." She stared at him. "What?" "We've received consecutive payment declines over the past 72 hours. Charles turned sharply. "That isn't possible." Richard opened the folder. "Our accounting office attempted to process your quarterly membership dues, wine locker fees, and event deposits." He paused professionally. Every transaction was declined. Victoria's expression froze. "I'm sure it's just a banking error." Richard nodded politely. I sincerely hope so." Then came the sentence that shattered what little dignity remained. "Until the outstanding balance is resolved, club policy requires us to suspend all membership privileges effective immediately." The ballroom became so quiet that someone dropping a champagne flute near the back sounded like a gunshot. For the first time in my life, the Montgomery family wasn't the center of attention because of their influence. They were the center of attention because everyone in that room had just watched their perfect image begin to crack. The last whisper died almost as quickly as it had begun, and every head in the ballroom turned toward the entrance. The double doors opened, not dramatically, not violently. They simply swung inward with the quiet confidence of people who never needed permission to enter a room. Colonel Silas Kincaid walked through first. He wore the dress uniform of a United States Marine Corps colonel, with every ribbon perfectly aligned and every movement deliberate. 2 armed military police officers followed several steps behind him. Beside them were 3 federal compliance investigators carrying black document cases instead of briefcases. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody flashed a badge. They didn't have to. Authority has its own language. The jazz quartet stopped playing altogether. Even the waitstaff stood still. From my office nearly 40 miles away, I watched the Trust Compliance Portal update in real time. Federal Compliance Team, on-site initial contact, confirmed I closed the legal brief I'd been reviewing and focused entirely on the encrypted activity log. The next chapter had officially begun. Inside the ballroom, Charles Montgomery recovered faster than anyone expected. He stepped forward with the practiced smile of a man who had spent years shaking hands with governors and judges. Colonel Silas Kincaid stopped 3 feet away. Mr. Montgomery, I wasn't informed we were expecting federal visitors. You weren't. Charles forced a polite laugh. There must be some misunderstanding. There is not. Victoria quickly joined her husband, still trying to maintain the appearance of control. I'm Victoria Montgomery. I know. I'm chairwoman of tonight's event. I know. We're in the middle of a charitable fundraiser. I know. Every answer came in the same calm tone. No emotion. No hesitation. Genevieve whispered to Nathan, "Who is that?" Nathan answered under his breath, "No idea." One of the older veterans attending the fundraiser quietly leaned toward his wife. "That's Marine Corps." She looked confused. "How can you tell?" He walks like he already knows the outcome. Charles extended his hand. "I'm sure we can discuss whatever this is privately." Colonel Kincaid didn't shake it. Instead, he nodded toward one of the investigators. The investigator removed a sealed federal envelope and handed it to Charles. Charles opened it immediately. His eyes moved across the first page. Then the second. His confident expression disappeared. "This is absurd." Colonel Kincaid remained silent. Charles looked up. "You obtained a federal warrant?" "We did." "Based on what?" "The contents are outlined in the attached findings. You've made a mistake. If that proves true, the investigation will reflect it." Victoria stepped closer. "This family has served this community for generations. So has the trust." Charles folded the warrant shut. "You have no authority to embarrass us in front of our guests." Colonel Kincaid finally answered with more than a few words. "Our authority comes from federal law, not guest lists." Several people near the stage quietly backed away. Nobody wanted to stand too close anymore. Charles lowered his voice. "I've served on state advisory boards. I'm aware. I know people in Richmond. I'm aware. I've worked with senators. I'm aware." Charles's smile vanished completely. "I have political protections." Colonel Kincaid looked directly into his eyes. "Political relationships do not suspend federal fiduciary enforcement." The sentence landed with the weight of a judge's ruling. Nathan slowly loosened his tie. Genevieve's hands started trembling around her champagne glass. Victoria still refused to believe what was happening. There must be some banking issue. No. One investigator opened a document case and removed several folders. "This is not a banking issue." Another folder. "This is a compliance investigation." Another. "Involving the Montgomery Military Legacy Trust." The words spread through the ballroom faster than any announcement could have. The trust? I thought that was General Montgomery's foundation. Trust? Federal investigation? Conversations erupted in every direction. Charles raised both hands. "Everyone, please remain calm." Nobody listened. One local developer quietly slipped his business card back into his pocket. A city council member stepped away from Charles without saying a word. People suddenly remembered they had drinks to refill on the opposite side of the ballroom. Distance became very popular. Colonel Kincaid turned toward the event coordinator. "May I borrow the microphone?" The stunned coordinator handed it over immediately. The ballroom fell silent again. No music, no laughter. Only hundreds of people waiting. Kincaid spoke clearly enough for every guest to hear. "My name is Colonel Silas Kincaid, Director of Compliance Oversight for the Montgomery Military Legacy Trust." No one interrupted. "I am here under lawful federal authority." He held up the signed warrant. "This evening, federal investigators have initiated enforcement actions related to the trust." Victoria took one desperate step forward. "You cannot announce this publicly," he continued as though she hadn't spoken. "Effective immediately, all discretionary trust assets remain under an active audit and fiduciary freeze." Across the room, someone quietly whispered, "So that's why the payment failed." Another answered, "My God," Colonel Kincaid continued. "The investigation concerned systemic financial irregularities involving trust administration." Charles finally snapped, "I object." His voice echoed through the ballroom. "This is defamation." "It is not. You haven't proven anything." We are in the process of doing exactly that. Charles pointed toward the microphone. You have no right to destroy my family's reputation before completing your investigation. Colonel Kincaid didn't even look at him. Instead, he read directly from the federal notice in his hand. There is reasonable cause to investigate suspected misappropriation of government-allocated defense bonds and other trust assets. The room seemed to stop breathing. Even people who knew nothing about trust law understood one thing: government money, federal investigators, military compliance. Those words never appeared together by accident. Kincaid looked across the ballroom one final time. Till the investigation concludes, no individual associated with the Montgomery Military Legacy Trust is authorized to access, transfer, pledge, distribute, or represent the availability of trust-controlled assets. He lowered the microphone. One sentence remained. He delivered it without raising his voice. The Montgomery Military Legacy Trust has been frozen due to systemic financial irregularities and suspected embezzlement involving government-allocated defense. The silence afterward lasted longer than the announcement itself. Then the cameras came out. Guests who had spent the evening taking pictures of champagne towers and engagement decorations suddenly pointed their phones somewhere entirely different. Toward Charles, toward Victoria, toward Genevieve. The perfect image they had spent years building was beginning to collapse, and for the first time, they couldn't buy enough influence to make people look away. I kept the encrypted dashboard open while another notification appeared across the top of my screen. On-site financial examination authorized. That was the point where a compliance review stopped being a warning and became an investigation. I knew exactly what would happen next because I'd helped conduct similar audits during military procurement cases. Nobody argued with the investigators anymore. The evidence did. Inside Ashford Hills Country Club, Colonel Kincaid asked the ballroom manager for a private office large enough to accommodate the review team. Within minutes, Charles, Victoria, Genevieve, Preston Hale, and several federal investigators sat around a long conference table beneath bright overhead lights. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different from the ballroom. No flowers, no champagne, no music. Just laptops, document scanners, evidence folders, and silence. A forensic accountant introduced herself. Rebecca Nolan, Federal Financial Compliance Division. She placed a thick binder on the table. We'll begin with estate maintenance expenditures. Charles folded his arms. My attorneys will cooperate. Rebecca nodded. Good. She opened the first section. The Montgomery Military Legacy Trust paid approximately $3.8 million in estate maintenance over the past 5 fiscal years. Charles answered immediately. The Pinecrest property is historic. So are many federal properties. She clicked a remote. A spreadsheet appeared on the wall monitor. Historic properties still require legitimate invoices. She highlighted one vendor. Blue Ridge Heritage Restoration, LLC. Rebecca looked toward Charles. Please describe this contractor. They handled structural preservation. For how long? Several years. She typed a few commands. Our investigators searched every Virginia business registration. Another click. No active registration. Another. No dissolved corporation. Another. No tax filings. She looked back at Charles. I'll search neighboring states. Nothing. The company does not legally exist. The room became very quiet. Charles cleared his throat. They may have operated under another name. Rebecca nodded once. We considered that possibility. She opened another folder. Our team also searched federal contractor databases. Nothing. State licensing records. Nothing. Commercial insurance registrations. Nothing. Workers' compensation filings. Nothing. She closed the folder. There is no evidence this contractor has ever existed. Charles looked toward Preston Hale. His attorney remained silent. Rebecca continued. Despite that, she projected another page. The trust paid Blue Ridge Heritage Restoration exactly $2,417,860.55. Genevieve frowned. That's impossible. Rebecca answered without emotion. The bank confirms every transfer. She clicked again. A payment timeline appeared. Dozens of transactions, different dates, different invoice numbers, same destination account. One investigator slid several printed invoices across the table. Rebecca picked one up. Invoice number 44 went. She compared it with another. Invoice number 5126. Then another. Invoice number 6372. She laid them side by side. The signatures are identical. Charles finally spoke. Most contractors sign consistently. Rebecca smiled politely. These weren't signed consistently. She turned one invoice upside down. They were copied. The room stayed silent. She zoomed in on the projected image. The same pen stroke appears in exactly the same location across 3 separate years. Another investigator added, "Our forensic imaging software confirmed digital duplication." No one argued. Rebecca changed topics. "Let's discuss federal military grant expenditures." My attention sharpened. That was the section Grandpa had always worried about. The Montgomery Military Legacy Trust managed several defense-related educational grants funded through restricted government allocations. Every dollar carried strict reporting requirements. Rebecca opened another spreadsheet. Grant account 7. She paused. Authorized purpose. One investigator answered, "Educational support for military families." Rebecca nodded. Actual expenditures, another click. Luxury boutique Milano, 18,944.72. Maison Elise, 12,066 and 30. Valora Paris, 9,882.40. Charles stared at the screen. Rebecca continued. All charged to restricted grant accounts. Another purchase, designer handbags. Another, jewelry. Another, private fashion consulting. Then international airfare, business class, Lake Como. Genevieve slowly looked down at the table. Rebecca turned toward her. "Can you explain these purchases?" She swallowed. "My father handled the finances." "Did you receive these items?" "I don't remember." Rebecca opened another folder. We anticipated that answer. She removed glossy photographs, Genevieve at charity events, Genevieve on social media, Genevieve leaving luxury boutiques. Every photograph carried a timestamp, every handbag matched an invoice, every designer outfit matched a purchase from the trust. One investigator quietly placed a tablet in front of Genevieve. Her own social media posts. "This dress?" Rebecca asked. $7,431.80. Swipe. "This handbag?" $5,918 and swipe again. "These shoes?" $2,204.67. Genevieve covered her mouth. Nathan leaned farther away in his chair without saying a word. Nobody wanted to be associated with the documents piling up on the table. Rebecca wasn't finished. She opened the final binder. "This section concerns banking activity." The words immediately changed the room. Charles straightened. Victoria finally spoke. "There must be some misunderstanding." Rebecca calmly replied, "I sincerely wish there were." She projected another chart. 3 different bank accounts, different account holders, money flowing through each one, then returning, then leaving again, one investigator explained. The transfers were structured to disguise the original source. Rebecca nodded. "We traced every transaction." She highlighted several signatures. "Mrs. Montgomery." Victoria looked up. "These authorization forms contain your signature." "They're mine." Rebecca placed another document beside them. "This signature belongs to Lieutenant Commander Jocelyn Montgomery." Victoria looked confused. "So?" Rebecca looked directly at her. "Lieutenant Commander Montgomery did not sign these." Silence. The signature was copied. Another page appeared, then another, then another. Every one of them carried Jocelyn's forged signature authorizing financial activity she had never approved. Charles finally raised his voice. "This is outrageous." "No," Rebecca answered calmly. "This is documented." She handed a thick report to Colonel Kincaid. "Our forensic examination confirms repeated unauthorized use of Lieutenant Commander Montgomery's identity credentials in banking and trust documentation." She paused only long, enough for everyone to absorb the sentence. Combined with fabricated vendors, falsified invoices, and diverted restricted funds, the evidence supports its findings consistent with systemic bank fraud, identity theft, and ongoing financial deception. No one in the room spoke, not Charles, not Victoria, not Genevieve, not even Preston Hale. Because stacked neatly across that conference table was something far more persuasive than opinions. Years of bank records, tax filings, digital timestamps, transfer confirmations, forensic signature analysis. Every page pointed in exactly the same direction. For the first time since my grandfather died, the Montgomery family wasn't fighting rumors. They were staring at proof they couldn't explain away. I closed the audit report and buttoned my Navy service dress jacket before walking into the Federal Compliance Office. Colonel Silas Kincaid looked up from the conference table. "They've finished." I read the findings. He nodded once. "The seizure order has been approved." I assumed it would be. He handed me a copy anyway. Unlike my parents, I actually read legal documents before discussing them. The first page carried the federal authorization. The second listed every trust-controlled asset. The Pinecrest Road estate appeared halfway down the page. Ownership: Montgomery Military Legacy Trust. Not Charles Montgomery, not Victoria Montgomery. The trust. Exactly as my grandfather intended. Colonel Kincaid folded his hands. The sheriff's department is already on the way. I understand. You don't have to attend. I know. He studied me for a moment, but you will, yes. Not because I wanted revenge, because I was still the acting successor trustee. Protecting trust property remained my responsibility until a court ordered otherwise. 40 minutes later, a convoy pulled through the front gates of the Pinecrest Road estate. 2 sheriff's patrol vehicles, 1 federal transport van, an evidence truck, several unmarked government SUVs, the same circular driveway that had welcomed politicians and business leaders only days earlier now filled with law enforcement. The house looked exactly the same: perfect landscaping, fresh flowers, spotless windows. Appearances lasted longer than truth. Sheriff Daniel Mercer approached the front entrance with a folded court order in his hand. I remained several steps behind beside Colonel Kincaid. The front door opened before anyone knocked. Victoria looked annoyed, then confused, then frightened. What is this? Sheriff Mercer handed her the paperwork. Mrs. Montgomery, we're serving a court-authorized possession order. She barely glanced at the first page. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake. Charles appeared behind her. I'll handle this. He reached for the documents. His confidence lasted less than 15 seconds. You can't remove us from our own home, Colonel Kincaid answered calmly. It is not your home. Charles looked up sharply. What? The Pinecrest Road property is wholly owned by the Montgomery Military Legacy Trust. I've lived here for 28 years. Occupancy and ownership are different legal concepts. Charles shook his head. This is ridiculous. No, Kincaid pointed toward the order. During an active fiduciary freeze, trust property must be secured. Victoria looked directly at me for the first time that day. You. I said nothing. You caused this. I initiated an audit. You destroyed your own family. I protected the trust. She laughed bitterly. Listen to yourself. The deputies entered the residence. They weren't aggressive. They were methodical. Each room was photographed. Major assets were documented. Entry logs were created. One deputy politely explained, "You'll be allowed to collect personal clothing, medication, identification, and essential items." Charles interrupted. I own everything in this house. The deputy looked toward Colonel Kincaid. Kincaid simply handed over the property schedule. The deputy read it. I'm sorry, sir. He looked back at Charles. The furniture, artwork, vehicles assigned to the estate, and financial records are all listed as trust property pending judicial review. Charles's shoulders dropped. For the first time in my life, I saw him run out of arguments. Outside, another scene unfolded. Genevieve's white luxury SUV remained parked beside the front entrance, exactly where she'd left it after rushing home from the country club. A tow truck slowly backed into position. She hurried outside just in time to see the driver lowering the wheel lift. Hey, the driver stopped. Ma'am, what are you doing? I'm here for vehicle recovery. You can't tow my car. He checked the paperwork. Actually, he adjusted his glasses. It's a leased vehicle, I know. The leasing company issued a repossession authorization this morning. My payments aren't late. The driver remained polite. The finance company says they are. She stared at him. No. They also noted multiple declined automatic withdrawals. Genevieve reached for her phone. I'll fix it. She called the leasing office, straight to customer service. 5 minutes later, she ended the call without saying a word. The automatic payments had all been connected to accounts funded through the frozen trust. No payments, no lease, no luxury SUV. Several influencers who had attended the charity gala happened to be standing near the driveway recording updates about the investigation. Their cameras naturally turned toward the tow truck. Genevieve immediately covered her face. 3 days earlier, she'd happily posed for photos beside that same vehicle. Now it disappeared onto a flatbed in front of thousands of future social media viewers. Nobody laughed. Honestly, it didn't feel funny. It felt sad. Watching someone build an identity entirely around borrowed money always ends the same way. Inside the mansion, deputies carried labeled evidence boxes through the foyer, financial records, computer hard drives, external storage devices, bank statements. Every item received a barcode. Every movement was documented. Nobody rushed. Real investigations rarely do. Victoria suddenly stormed through the front doorway toward me. 2 deputies instinctively stepped between us. It's her! She pointed directly at me. She's the reason my daughter's wedding is ruined. Neither deputy moved. Victoria's voice cracked. You monster! The word echoed across the driveway. You couldn't stand seeing your own sister happy. I looked at her quietly. I wore my Navy service uniform because I'd come directly from work. Every button was polished, every ribbon properly aligned, everything exactly as regulations required. My grandfather used to say uniforms mattered because they reminded people they represented something larger than themselves. Victoria kept shouting, "You've destroyed everything," I answered, with the same calm voice I'd used throughout the investigation. No, she stared at me. You and Dad destroyed it when you treated a military trust like a personal checking account. You always thought you were better than us. No, I shook my head once. I believed the law applied to all of us. She looked ready to say something else. The words never came. Behind her, federal officers finished loading the final evidence containers into the transport van. One investigator nodded toward Colonel Kincaid. Complete. Kincaid acknowledged the report. The transport officers climbed inside. The heavy rear doors closed. The steel locks engaged with a deep metallic slam that echoed through the quiet driveway. It wasn't just the sound of evidence being secured. It was the sound of years of lies finally running out of places to hide. I watched the convoy pull away from the Pinecrest Road estate without celebrating. There wasn't anything to celebrate. A family had spent decades protecting its reputation while quietly abandoning its principles. In less than 10 minutes, the reputation disappeared. The principles had vanished long before I ever activated the audit. I rested both hands on the cold steel rail and watched the Atlantic roll beneath the bow of the destroyer. 3 weeks had passed. The investigation had moved out of the headlines and into federal court, exactly where complicated financial crimes belonged. My grandfather's trust remained under independent administration while auditors completed their final reports. The scholarship program had resumed under temporary supervision. Veterans' grants were flowing again. Every legitimate obligation of the trust had been protected. That had always been the goal. Not punishment, protection. The ocean didn't care about any of it. The ship cut through slate-gray water with the same steady rhythm it had every day since we left Norfolk. Salt spray drifted across the deck, and the wind carried away the last traces of the storm that had followed us offshore. A young ensign walked past me carrying a stack of legal folders. "Morning, Commander." "Morning. You heading below soon?" "In a little while." He nodded and continued toward Combat Information Center. Nobody on this ship treated me like someone's daughter. Nobody cared what neighborhood I grew up in. Nobody asked how expensive my family's house had been. Out here, your last name couldn't qualify your watch station. Only your work could. That was one of the reasons I'd stayed in uniform. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a worn military dog tag. The edges were scratched. The chain had been replaced twice. It wasn't valuable. It was honest. I rubbed my thumb across the stamped letters. Jocelyn Montgomery years ago. Before I left for my first overseas assignment, my father had picked up those same dog tags from the kitchen table. He'd laughed. "I can't believe you're actually wearing these." I remembered smiling. They're part of the uniform. They make you look like an enlisted kid trying to impress people. They identify me if something goes wrong. He'd toss them back onto the table. "I'd rather people recognize the Montgomery name than a piece of metal around your neck." At the time, I'd quietly picked them up and left for the airport. Now they rested in my hand again. Funny how a simple piece of stainless steel had outlasted every speech he'd ever given me about reputation. The ship's executive officer stepped beside me. "Everything all right?" "Yeah, you've been standing here a while. I needed some air." He looked out over the water. "Heard your legal team wrapped up that trust case, most of it. You win?" I thought about the question. Did I? My parents were facing criminal charges. Genevieve's engagement had quietly ended after Nathan decided he wanted nothing to do with federal investigations. The Pinecrest Road mansion sat empty while the court determined its future. None of that felt like winning. I don't think anybody won. The executive officer nodded slowly. Sometimes that's the most honest answer. He left me alone again. I slipped the dog tag back into my pocket. Another object remained there, a heavy ring of brass keys. The front door, the wine cellar, the side gate. The old workshop my grandfather used when I was a little girl. Federal investigators had returned the keys after securing the estate. As acting trustee, I technically had authority to keep them. Instead, I'd carried them with me for 3 weeks. Not because I wanted the house, because I hadn't decided what they meant anymore. I held them in my palm. The metal felt colder than the dog tag. Each key represented a room where I'd spent years trying to earn approval that had never been available. The dining room where birthdays became someone else's celebration. The study where my father asked me to abandon my oath. The front hallway where my mother told me to hide my car because it embarrassed the family. None of those doors led anywhere I wanted to return. Bosuzane's mate passed behind me. "Commander? Yeah? We'll be changing course in about 5 minutes. Thanks." I looked back toward the wake stretching behind the ship. Miles of white water disappeared into the horizon, always moving forward, never turning around to collect what had already been left behind. I wrapped my fingers around the keys one final time. Then I opened my hand. They slipped through the air without ceremony. No speech, no anger, no audience. The brass flashed once before disappearing beneath the dark Atlantic. The water closed over them as if they had never existed. I stayed there for another minute, watching the circles fade. I realized something my grandfather had understood long before I did. A family name can open a front door. It cannot make people welcome you once you're inside. Respect can't be inherited. It has to be practiced. Trust isn't created by blood. It's created by choices repeated over years. I had spent too much of my life believing that keeping peace meant accepting disrespect. It doesn't. Sometimes protecting your integrity means walking away from people who share your name. The Navy had never asked me to become someone else to belong. Neither had the sailors standing watch around me. They expected honesty, competence, responsibility, nothing more, nothing less. For the first time since I was a little girl, I wasn't carrying the weight of trying to fix a family that never wanted to change. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead. So did everything waiting beyond it. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and sacrificed enough, my family would eventually see my worth. They never did, and that's something I can finally accept without bitterness. My grandfather left me a trust because he believed integrity should always outweigh convenience. Protecting that trust wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of responsibility. Sometimes the hardest person to stand up for is yourself, especially when the people hurting you share your last name. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this: never confuse loyalty with permission to be mistreated. Real family doesn't ask you to betray your values to earn a seat at the table. Real family respects your boundaries, celebrates your success, and tells the truth even when it's uncomfortable. The day I let those keys sink into the Atlantic, I wasn't throwing away my past. I was letting go of the belief that I had to keep unlocking doors that only led to disappointment. My future didn't begin when my family lost everything. It began the moment I realized my self-respect was worth more than anything they could ever take away. And as the ship carried me toward the horizon, I finally understood that I wasn't leaving my family behind. I was finally sailing toward the life I had already earned. Before you leave, take a look at the story waiting on your screen right now. If you thought my family hid the truth behind money and appearances, the next case goes even further. And the ending caught thousands of viewers completely off guard. It's become one of the most watched stories on this channel for a reason. Click it now, and I'll meet you there.